Hi, good evening. Today I would like to talk about food chain in this segment. A food chain is a diagram of how organisms in an ecosystem depend on one another to get the nutrients and energy they need to live. For example, plants get energy from the sun. Some animals eat plants and some animals eat other animals. A food chain is a sequence of who eats whom in a biological community or ecosystem to obtain nutrition. Eating is an eternal lovemaking, a consumed and consummated relationship. A food chain starts with the primary energy source, usually the sun or boiling hot deep sea vents. The next link in the chain is an organism that makes its own food from the primary energy source. An example is photosynthetic plants that make their own food from sunlight using a process called photosynthesis, and chemosynthetic bacteria that make their food energy from chemicals in hydrothermal vents. These are called autotrophs or primary producers. Next come organisms that eat the autotrophs. These organisms are called herbivores or primary consumers. An example is a rabbit that eats grass. The next link in the chain is animals that eat herbivores. These are called carnivore or secondary consumers. An example is a snake that eats rabbits. In turn, these animals are eaten by larger predators. An example is an owl that eats snakes. The tertiary consumers are eaten by quaternary consumers. An example is a hawk that eats owls. Man is known as omnivore, one who eats everything. Each food chain ends with the top predator, an animal with no natural enemies, such as alligator, hawk, polar bear, or man. As the energy flows from organism to organism, energy is lost at each step. A network of many food chains is called a food web. When any organism dies, it is eventually eaten by detritivore like vultures, worms, crabs, and microscopic bacteria, and broken down by decomposers, mostly bacteria and fungi, and the exchange of energy continues. In any food web, energy is lost each time one organism eats another. Because of this, there have to be many more plants than there are plant eaters. There are more autotrophs than heterotrophs, and more plant eaters than meat eaters. Although there is intense competition between animals, there is also interdependence. When one species goes extinct, it can affect an entire chain of other species and have unpredictable consequences. As the number of carnivores in a community increases, they eat more and more of the herbivore, decreasing the herbivore population. It then becomes harder and harder for the carnivores to find herbivores to eat, and the population of carnivores decreases. In this way, the carnivores and herbivores stay in a relatively stable equilibrium, each limiting the other population. A similar equilibrium exists between plants and plant eaters. Man is the omnivore, eating plant and meat. He is called top predator. Humans have constantly affected the food chain by putting pressure on food resources. When we spray pesticides, we put the food chain in danger. By breaking one link on the chain means all of the organisms above that link are in threat of extinction. It is like a domino effect. By hunting animals nearly to extinction, everything above the animal in the food chain is put in danger. A chain reaction in the food chain can be perilous since the food chain provides energy that all living things must have in order to survive. It is imperative that we protect it. However, the contrary is true. Due to our insatiable appetite, the entire ecosystems are crumbling. Oceans, for example. Global fish stocks are exploited or depleted to such an extent that without urgent measures, we may be the last generation to catch from the ocean. Fish are the last wild animal that we hunt in large numbers, and yet we may be the last generation to do so. Around 85% of global fish stocks are overexploited or in recovery from exploitation. It's a worrying sign that we could be losing fish old enough to create offspring that replenish populations. Large areas in the Mediterranean and North Sea now resemble a desert. The seas have been expunged of fish using increasingly efficient methods such as bottom trawling. And now these heavily subsidized industrial fleets are cleaning up tropical oceans too. Rich West African fisheries are now overexploited. Coastal fisheries have declined 50% in the past 30 years, according to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. Catches in the tropics are expected to decline a further 40% by 2050, and yet some 400 million people in Africa and Southeast Asia rely on fish caught to provide their protein and minerals. With climate change expected to impact agricultural production, people are going to rely more than ever on fish for their nutritional needs. In severely depleted zones, the only way to restore stocks is by introducing protected reserves where all fishing is banned. In other areas, quota compliance needs to be properly monitored. Fishing vessels could be licensed and fitted with tracking devices to ensure they don't stray into illegal areas. Spot checks on fish could be carried out to ensure size and species, and fish could even be tagged so that the authorities and consumers can ensure its sustainable source. The other option is to take humanity's usual method of dealing with food shortages and move from hunter gathering to farming. Already, more than half of the fish we eat comes from farming. In China, it's a high as 80%, but doing this on an industrial scale has its own problems. Fish farms produce slurry of toxic runoff manure, which fertilizes algae in the oceans, reducing the oxygen available to other species and creates dead zones. Humanity is not limiting its impacts to fish commonly found on the menus. Exotic sea creatures from turtles to manta ray to marine mammals are being hunted to extinction. Shark numbers, for example, have declined by 80%, with 1/3 of shark species now at risk of extinction. The top marine predator is no longer shark, it's us. A decline in shark numbers has a significant impact on the marine ecosystem. Ignoring these problems would lead humanity to serious consequences in finding food. Let us keep our food chain healthy and wealthy. Goodbye.